And we are live. All
Yeah,
right. Let's maybe wait a few more seconds. Hey there, Jens. Good to have you here.
yeah. I think we're not going to wait for too long though,
Yes, okay. I would
because we have
say
also a tight schedule for today. We have a
um,
packed program here.
absolutely. Okay, so I would suggest let's start with the program. Welcome to our first ever stream here on our Twitch channel. We are super excited about today because we are going to take a first peek into the Kern AI Refinery together with you. We have prepared a very nice program, and we are also super excited because this is the first ever live stream that we are doing. And yeah, we are curious to find out how that is going. With me here today is the one and only Moritz Feuerfeil. He's a data scientist slash developer relations person. Moritz, good to have you here. How are you doing today?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Leo. I'm great. I'm so glad that we have this opportunity now to have this different kind of community engagement, where we can just show you everything that we've been building for all this time, also in a live setting. And yeah, don't forget that after this session, we will have an exclusive Q&A on our Discord, on our community Discord channel. And yeah, you can access that by typing !Discord in the chat, for example. But all these commands we'll come to later. Leo, what are you most excited about today?
Well, I really love working with the refinery, and so probably that's what I'm most excited about. I'm also really excited about to see what questions the people might have about the tool. How about you? What are you most excited about?
Yeah, I think just showing this tool from start to end, basically. We will, of course, in this 1 hour that we have booked today, we cannot show everything. So in the end, there will even be an outlook on what we haven't covered yet. But I just think it's such an awesome tool, and I want to take every barrier that people might have with this tool, because starting out with a new tool that has so many like features is sometimes a little bit hard. But we are here today to lower that barrier or to even remove it all the way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to give you a small outline on our program today, first of all, we're going to tell you what are the requirements to run our tool. We are also going to show you how you can install the Kern AI Refinery. Then we have prepared a sample project that we are going to walk through together with you. And afterwards, we're going to take some time to answer all your questions that you might have over on our Discord channel. If you want to follow along, we have prepared a cheat sheet that you can access by !cheat sheet in the comments. And then you can download that so that you'll always be on the same page as we are. Okay, Moritz, did I miss anything or are we good to go?
I think we are good to go. I'm gonna switch scenes now so that you can see what I see, basically, on my screen here. So there also in the bottom left corner of the overlay now are all the chat commands that are available for today. So with !Discord, you can join our Discord. So there's an invitation link then popping up in chat. The cheat sheet I just posted in chat. We will now give you basically a second to download it, to look at it, and we will follow along that guide that is provided there. Then we also have, of course, our GitHub, our socials, and the website, which is just Kern AI, but if you like clicking on links more than typing, then I guess you can also just do it in the chat. So Leo, before we start, right, in the cheat sheet, we have a section that is called technical requirements. So before we go out and tell people to install this, what should they be aware of?
To run our application, you need at least 20 gigabytes of storage on your local machine. I would say that's not too much. We also recommend that you have ideally 16 gigabytes of RAM. More is always better, of course. If you only have 8 gigabytes of RAM, the app should still run on your machine, but for a smooth and seamless experience, we recommend that you have 16 gigabytes of RAM. The Refinery also runs on Mac as well as Linux and Windows, so all major operation systems should work. To run the app, you also need Docker Desktop installed on your computer. And if you want to install our tool via pip, the Python package management tool, you also, of course, need Python installed on your machine, but that is totally optional.
Yeah, as we can see also from the installation from our README on the GitHub repository, that there are two options. We can pip install, or we can clone it basically from the repository and start it from there. Today we're going to talk about the version where we just clone it from the repository, go into it and execute our starting script, which makes it really easy. Everything we're going to show today will be on Windows 10. But we have also covered, like, you can use this open source tool basically on all available operating systems. So Linux shouldn't be a problem because I also work on Linux and that also works. And we have a lot of developers with Mac OS, so there it also works flawlessly. I would say, Leo, that I will just go ahead right now and show the people how to start Refinery after they cloned the repository.
Sounds good to me.
So we're gonna quickly go into our documents here, go into where I have stored all my GitHub projects, and then I'm gonna go into the Refinery. I already cloned that because we already did a test run of this, but yeah, if you haven't cloned it yet, then it's just a simple git clone into the repository where you want. Then we would move into it, and if we are here in the Refinery, we can see what kind of files are in there, and we have basically 2 starting and 2 stop scripts depending on what operating system you are. So start is for Linux and macOS, and the start.bat is for Windows. So I'm gonna actually go ahead right now and just execute the starting script for Windows by typing start.bat. Very important that you have your Docker desktop up and running, because otherwise all the spawning of containers will result in errors because you have Docker desktop not running. So Docker desktop is installed and running on my machine right now, and I'm gonna go ahead and execute the starting script, which you can also do by double clicking on it in the Explorer, but I'm gonna stay here in my terminal. Once you start the Refinery, you will see that also it is starting the database right here. So the database is with relative path. So where you start the Refinery, a new database is basically initialized. And if you start the Refinery from a different directory, then there will be a different database created. So always be careful where you start and stop your Refinery, because there is also then the database. I usually just start the Refinery from the directory where it is also stored. So now we have all our containers up and running. When you run it for the first time, you will see that all these containers get pulled from our hosting, but I already have the versions that I need basically here. So there are 22 different services that are running and interacting with each other. So these are all started, which, if they are already downloaded, doesn't take too long. Right here we have the link to access our UI. So I'm just gonna go ahead, paste it into my browser. And here you are greeted with our kind of first screen where you can see that ready to launch, start your first project. On the sidebar, we can also see that we have links to our documentation, links to our API, where you can use an SDK to interact with your project, and also the link to our community, where you get a Discord invite. You can go full screen also for, I guess, less distraction overall, and you can go into the version overview, which is a really neat feature we have, where you can see that there are your locally installed version right now, or your running version, and the version that is remotely available. As you can see, as we published today a new update, the 1.4.0, I am not up to date right here, but since we already tested this whole stream basically on the version 1.3, we're just gonna go with that for today. Leo, when we are started with the screen, what should we do now?
So I think the screen right now looks a bit empty, and it desperately needs a new project. So I would propose that we just start a new project now.
That is exactly right. Maybe you can tell our viewers what sample use case we brought today.
We have prepared a very cool and interesting sample use case about detecting clickbaity headlines. We have a data set that contains both serious and, let's say, normal news headlines, but it also contains very clickbaity headlines, such as 10 best summer outfits to stun all your friends. And we're going to build a data set out of that to then be able to classify between clickbaity news articles and, let's say, normal news articles.
Yeah, that is, of course, as Leo mentioned, just a small toy data set and a toy use case just to show you the application, so we don't have to lose too much time on embedding creation and so on, but we're going to come to that. First, we have to upload our data, actually. And before uploading data, we should always make sure that it is in the right format. We support many formats, for example, CSV, JSON, spreadsheet, and we right here have a CSV file, but before uploading it, to not run into any errors, we will look at it with our text editor of our choice, which for me will be Visual Studio Code. And we can see this is a very simple CSV file with just a running ID, a headline, which is not really, it's not quoted or it's not specially treated in any way. So, and the comma is the separator. So this is a very standard traditional CSV file that you would get from a pandas data frame export, for example. If this would not be the standard file that we saw right now, we also have different import options here where you can specify the separator, line terminator, the quoting. It's basically the same arguments that you would put into loading a pandas data frame. But as we are really, this is a really standard CSV, we don't have to specify anything. We're just gonna click upload the data per drag and drop and click proceed.
Awesome.
As you can see in the bottom left corner, there are notifications. So we also have notifications in the refinery. So if you have if there are processes that take a little bit longer, for example, here's the tokenization that is currently happening, then there are notifications to remind you that something has finished or something has started. You can go into the notification center at the very top to also have an overview over your notifications in your projects. For example, we can see here now that the tokenization is completed. This is especially useful if you run into errors and you want to inspect these errors later on again. But back to the project right here, we are now in the settings page. Leo, we are now uploaded our data. We are in the first page where in the settings page, but what should we do now?
So the first step that we should take now is head over to the data browser, which we have on the left-hand side, and check the data that we just imported. to make sure that the import was clean and that all the data is in the right place and that it's looking good. So let's do exactly that.
That is exactly right. So we can already see the data schema where we have basically our two attributes that we uploaded, and the data type is inferred automatically, but still there might be some encoding errors and so on. So always go into the data browser first, check your data. And as we can see right here, everything seems to be just fine. So there are no weird encoding errors. The strings are perfectly represented and the integer as well. They're integers, so they are just, they're fine. Yeah, we check the data here. The data browser, of course, does have much more capability than just checking your data after uploading, but we will come to that later on. First, before continuing with the project, we will have to do a few more adjustments on the settings page. Leo, the settings page is now still a little bit empty. What should we do here?
Well, first of all, we should create a labeling task, which you have on the lower half of your settings page. And on the labeling task, we can create a task for either classification or for information extraction. Because we want to differentiate between clickbaity and non-clickbaity articles, we have a classification task, and so we can create just that. You can already see that the task type is set to multi-class classification, and that's exactly what we want here right now. And to the right, you can also add some labels. In our case, I would suggest we create the labels clickbait and not clickbait. These are just two labels, so it's not too much, but you can basically add as many labels as you like. And you can also give them fancy colors. For example, for the bad clickbait, we're going to choose a very nice red. And for the not clickbaity articles, we're going to label them with a bright green. Okay, that looks good.
We now created our labeling task. Labeling tasks are, just as the name suggests, tasks that you will label in the refinery. The full record, of course, just has the multi-class classification. We will not talk about the information extraction in this stream today, where you can label also individual tokens and not only whole records or whole attributes. But if you're interested in that, stay longer after the stream. We have, as we said, the Q&A. So you can type !Discord, where you get a Discord invite, and then you can have access to the exclusive Q&A that we're doing on our community Discord, and then you can ask about also the information extraction labeling if you're interested in that. It is very important to give your labels expressive names, because we also have a zero-shot module included in Refinery where you can use the labels themselves for zero-shot classification, and the zero-shot classification wouldn't be of much use if the labels were just carrying the names yes or no, for example. So always make sure to have expressive label names. Now we created our labeling task. Leo, there's still one more option that we have on our settings screen. What is this all about?
I guess you are talking about the embeddings. And before we can continue, or before we should continue, we need to pre-process our data first. And because our data is in the form of text, we can't use that data as is right now, for example, in a machine learning algorithm, because computers and machine learning algorithms, they don't really like texts and they prefer numbers. And that's exactly what the embeddings are all about. The embeddings are numeric representations of texts that still keep the context of a text, but in a numeric way. And you can create these embeddings very easily by clicking on Generate Embeddings. Here, we want to generate embeddings on the target attribute headline, and the granularity attribute also looks fine for now. Attribute basically is the whole sentence that we want to embed. And you can choose many different pre-trained models for creating the embeddings. Basically, any model from huggingface.com would work here. But we have also selected some models for you in the drop-down list here. And for now, the Distilbert base uncased model should be just fine. It is a very good model for creating embeddings, and it's also not too large. All right.
Exact. So the granularity is basically just how the embeddings are aggregated. So if we have granularity set on attribute, then we use sentence transformers who basically aggregate the information of a whole attribute into a single embedding, which is what we want in our classification use case, for example. Now we're just gonna click add embedding, and it's easy as that. So the embedding now loads, it is initializing, and while this is loading, we don't have to waste any time because this is in theory not a required step, but a step that is most definitely coming in handy later on. But while this is loading, we're gonna go to one of the other pages that we have in Refinery, because in sum we have 5 different pages: the overview, the data browser, the labeling, heuristics, and settings. And now, as we are waiting basically for the embedding to be created, we're gonna jump into the labeling page and label some data.
Sounds great. Let's do it.
This is the labeling page. I'm gonna zoom in here so you have a little bit more of an overview. It is really kept simple, but that is also really important for labeling, so you don't get distracted in any way. We handle labeling in labeling sessions. So as you can see here, we fetch 1,000 records for a labeling session, and now you can basically just label your data. So the labeling tasks are basically visible here. We have just our full record labeling task, and we just have these 2 options. In the bottom, there are a few options that you can turn on or off. For example, you can hide heuristic labels, which we will come to later, and you can automatically get the next record, which is really handy if you just have a single labeling task with a single kind of label. So here we can just decide whether it's clickbait or not clickbait, and to automatically get the next record, we save some time just pressing the right arrow all the time. Yeah, I'm just gonna quickly label about 20 records here so that we have a basis for our processing later on. While we label, Leo, what should we look out for? Because when we are labeling, we are also seeing the data, right? There are maybe a little bit of foreshadowing possible patterns that we have in our data. So maybe keep an eye on this while I'm labeling this.
Yeah, good idea. The first labeling session that we are doing also allows us to get a feel for the data that we have and to spot possible patterns in the data that we can then later use for our heuristics, for example. But more on that later on.
So as these are news headlines, we see that these are typical, or these are headlines in general. We see that these are of the typical form. So there's political stuff, there's like silly stuff. And for example, here, 25 funny, random, bizarre things. Well, this is clickbait, at least in my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have now 20 records labeled. And I don't know about you, but as we also use this data set a lot, of course, we are a bit more biased, but I discovered some patterns on this data already. And for example, I have a suspected pattern that these titles, these headlines that start with a number here, for example, 17 lyrics that will guide you to self-acceptance and so on and so forth, they seem all a little bit clickbaity, right? I all gave them the clickbait, yeah, the clickbait label. So 25 funny and so on and so forth. Leo, I now have a suspected pattern here in the labeling. And we at Refinery, we at Kern AI, we don't like the boring manual stuff too much. So we also have some integration of using patterns. But I have just, right now, I just have a suspicion. How would I validate this kind of suspicion in a Refinery?
Yeah, first of all, good seeing on your part. I also have a suspicion. Let's head over to the data browser, because there we can check if our suspicion is actually correct. Because we saw that a lot of the clickbaity headlines, they start with a digit or start with a number. And here in the data browser, for example, we could sort all of our headlines so that we get the ones starting with a number first. And then we can have a look if this pattern is actually correct or if we are mistaken.
Exactly. So we have a lot of kind of features here in the data browser to filter and to order your results. And we do not want to do any filtering right now. We just want to order the results so that we have the records that start with a number first. As you can see here, of course, if you're ordering, it's not only numbers, but it's also special signs. But yeah, we're just going to scroll down a little bit. And here we see already starting with a number. And yeah, we will start from here now a labeling session, which is really, really neat, because when you order and filter your data in the data browser, you can not only observe the data itself and get a good grasp of your data, but you can also directly label it from here, basically. So we can go to the record that we want to label here, and we're just going to click continue with this record. This is going to start a new labeling session where the previous and the next record, basically, they're all in the same order that we just saw in the data browser. So we can filter and order our data in the data browser and then jump directly into the labeling part, which is quite awesome. And as we can see here now, this all seems really, really clickbaity.
Yeah, absolutely. Seems like our suspicion is actually correct, and that most of the clickbaity headlines, at least some of them, start with a number. Some of these headlines are actually very hilarious.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is enough for me. I now kind of validated my suspicion. Of course, in a real scenario with real data, you would probably do a little more of this labeling in this way. But for now, for this demonstration, my suspected pattern is a pattern I want to express in Refinery. Leo, how would I exactly do that?
Yes, as you already stated, we here at Kern AI, we don't like to do things manually very much. So we came up with a solution for that. And you can head over to the heuristics page on the left. And there we can create a selection of heuristics. For example, we can create a labeling function with Python to capture the pattern that we just saw. So we can write a simple function with Python to label every headline that starts with a digit as clickbait.
That is just really awesome, because I have now seen that in the data there is a pattern, and normally I would just manually go through it and have this pattern in my head, basically, so this information. But with the heuristics, we took the approach that you can kind of integrate your domain expertise, your clickbait domain expertise in this case, into the system, and you can kind of integrate that information through heuristics, which is really, really awesome, because then your knowledge is kind of, first, your knowledge is explicitly represented in the shape and form of labeling functions, for example. This does not only help scale the labeling itself, but it also helps in documenting your project overall, because then people don't have to question each other, why did you label it like that? Why did you label it like that? Because the information now is explicitly represented, which is awesome. You're not gonna have to worry about all these texts here because we are here to explain it to you, but if you would be on your own, I would make sure to give it a read. So we're gonna call this starts with digit right here. We are on the labeling task clickbait, which is the only one we have. We could also provide some documentation here, but for the sample use case, we're not gonna do that. We are now greeted here with the labeling function details page, where you can see that here in the middle, in the heart of it, is the code that is actually generating the labels basically that are generated by the labeling function. And here we can also have some really interesting or useful other information. So we know what attributes our data has. So we know how to access them basically. Then we also have the labeling task that this is running on with the labels. So we don't have to kind of go back and forth and worry about that. In these labeling functions, you can also import other libraries. So for example, here we have our installed libraries, which you can take a look at. And you can even use outside requests. But for now, we're just going to use good old plain Python. And I'm going to quickly write a function here that looks whether or not something starts with a digit and then returns the clickbait label. So our records can be accessed as dictionaries right here. So we first extract the headline itself, which would be record headline, which is what is really important, as we also have in the example comment here, is that our string attributes or our text attributes in Refinery are processed as spacey documents. So to really get just the text of it, we also have to do .text. As we want to filter whether or not something starts with a number, we're also gonna split our data here. And now we're just gonna check basically if the first entry of our splitted headline list is a digit. And then we're gonna return clickbait. Always make sure that it is written correctly. To do that, I oftentimes just copy it from here, click to copy, and then paste it into here, which is just really easy and prevents you from making any typos. Leo, some of the viewers might notice that I'm just returning clickbait here. Why am I not returning not clickbait in the else case?
That's an excellent question. And the simple answer is just because a headline might not start with a digit, it still can be clickbait. And if we would use an else statement and label everything else with not clickbait, we might do a lot of labeling errors. And we don't want to do that. So just labeling everything that starts with a digit with clickbait here should be just fine.
Now that we just run the function, it is saved automatically. We get the container logs output here. So everything went smoothly. We finished writing, finished execution. Everything is perfect. And down here we have some statistics. The estimated precision, you can hover over them and they even say what it is, true positives for the reference data you labeled. It is at 100% right now, but we also didn't label too much reference data. So 100% is always a little bit suspicious, even for especially for those really simple kind of labeling functions. But all these other stats right here are represented. Leo, what are these all about?
So the coverage basically is the amount of records that we were able to label. And for labeling whole sentences or whole records, coverage and hits will always be the same. But if we are doing, for example, information extraction, we can have multiple hits in a single record. But for now, these are the same. And as you see, we just used 3 lines of very simple Python, and we were able to automatically label more than 500 records. So I would say this is already a huge success. Although I would say that the accuracy of 100% is a bit suspicious, and that's a bit too high, maybe. So maybe there's a way that we can validate if this number is actually correct. So what do you think about that?
I think that's an awesome idea, because there are many cases where you just label your data, you come up with a labeling function, you put in that labeling function, and of course, because you discovered that pattern while labeling the reference data, the labeling function will have maybe a slight positive bias, because that's the labeling function that you came up with by labeling the reference data. So it is also it is always recommended, and also, I guess, best practice here, to validate that labeling function with random data, or with random data that the labeling function made a prediction for. This is really easily, this can be easily done by, again, accessing the data browser here. So on the left, we have our filter capabilities, and we can go into the labeling task clickbait, and here we have our heuristics. And here's also the starts with digit heuristic that we can select. And now we have our coverage of 542 records, and we can filter basically just the data that is hit by this labeling function to validate it. So as I said, we kind of want to validate it in a random manner. So we're also going to do result order random with this seed. And now we have basically our labeling function from this one labeling function validation data slice that we created right here. Leo, do I have to input this every time? Because this would be a little cumbersome.
Yeah, that would be very tedious. No, you don't have to create the filter every time. You can quite easily save the filter, either as a static filter or as a dynamic filter, so that you can access it at some other point in time. The dynamic filter will change over time as you work through the data, while the static filter will, as the name already says, will stay the same regardless of what you do.
Yeah, so we are, for example, here gonna go with digit LF validation, save the filter, and there's one little thing I forgot, because to really validate this data, we don't want to actually see data that we already have labeled, right? So we can also go into the labeling task and say manually labeled has no label. With that, of course, it shrinks a little bit, but we don't want to label data twice. So this is now the final validation data slice that we can use. So has no label. And now we can even update the filter. So it represents this new filter setting that we did. So we can go into the filter, adjust the settings, update it, and it's saved again. And from here on out, I'm just gonna quickly label 2 or 3 records, and then we're gonna see if the 100% accuracy actually hold true. As we can see.
And the first one is already not clickbait, I would say.
So as we could see right there, there was just a year number to be seen, which is most often not really clickbait. But other than this, this is really, really clickbaity.
Yes, so we see that the suspicion we have is mostly true, but it's not true all of the time.
But that is really
good to know.
And that is really the essence of these heuristics, right? These heuristics don't have to be perfect. They just have to represent some kind of domain knowledge or information. You just have to express some information, some signal with these, and the signal should be more basically than the noise that you're introducing. So it should be better than basically random guessing. But as long as you're introducing information to the system, these heuristics are great. So even though we have we had some problems by, for example, when something starts with a year, then you could refine this labeling function and rewrite it, for example, so to exclude years, but we're just going to leave it at this for now. We now validated this simple labeling function, but Leo, I feel like this digit labeling function is not enough. So we need more domain expertise here. So what are some, for example, what is another common labeling function that you're going to see in Refinery?
Well, the next thing that we can do is create a lookup list with words that we frequently see in our data. For example, I just noticed that a non-clickbaity headline that started with a number contained the word Britain. And so maybe we can create a lookup list that contains the names of geopolitical entities, for example, because the news headlines that contain the names of countries or cities are often, I would say, not clickbaity. And so we can use that information in our heuristics as well.
Yeah, that is right. So we can now, if we go into the heuristics tab, we can see that we have a bunch of options that we're going to come to later, but here are also lookup lists. And here we can create new lookup lists. And in these lookup lists, we can just collect a bunch of terms also with a description. So with a reasoning behind our decision that we added this term to the lookup list, which is, again, great documentation. And these terms then later can be used. Do I have to input them manually all the time, Leo?
Well, you can input them manually. For example, if you just stumble upon a new word that you find, you can add it to the list. However, if you create a information extraction task on the setting page and you go through your labels and mark some words there, they will get added to the lookup lists automatically. And so you don't have to do this by hand all the time. And these lookups lists, while they are relatively simple, they can save you a tremendous amount of time and they become very, very handy later on. And as you already maybe see, we don't work with this data set the first time. We went through the data before this live session and took a look at the headlines, and we saw that there are actually quite a large number of geopolitical entities and country names represented in the data. And Moritz just quickly added them here.
Also, as Jens mentioned in the chat right here, there's also the option to paste a list, which would save you a lot of time, but for dramatic effect, I input them one by one. But yeah, also pasting your list is a really great idea.
True, absolutely. Thanks for the hint, Jens.
So we now put in a bunch of geopolitical terms right here that are written in the correct casing also, as you would see. And Leo, now we have this lookup list, but what are we actually able to do with it?
So maybe we want to create another labeling function where we go through each record, and every time a record contains a word from the lookup list, we want to label it as not clickbait. And that way we can maybe find new patterns in the data or correct falsely classified records. So, and you can simply import these lookup lists from knowledge and then state the name of the lookup list. In this case, I think it's geopolitical. Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
It is really cool that you can just import from knowledge, which is really, really awesome. But we now have geopolitical. This is basically just can be treated as a list. So we can iterate through these terms, for term in this list. And now we have the strings that are available in this list. So we're gonna just see if this term, again, this is really basic Python code. It is not refined to do very specific things. It is just a general if this term is in the string. You can, of course, further refine it with, for example, with, again, string splitting, for example, or regular expressions would probably also be a really great fit for this But as this is just a demo project, we're gonna stay as simple as possible. And we're gonna return the not clickbait here, which I again just copied and pasted. It is really important that for the geopolitical terms, as I said, the casing is really important, because if we lower everything, for example, EU or US will just be us, for example, and this will, of course, yield a lot of false positives. So we're gonna keep the casing intact here. We're gonna not lower the string. We're just gonna run that function.
Awesome.
Again, the estimated precision of 100%. So we're going to validate that also later on. But here we also see the first time that something has conflicts. Leo, what are these conflicts?
Well, the conflicts indicate that we have two labeling functions or two heuristics that are not agreeing with one another. And they are both saying that one record has a different label. So maybe we should check out what that is all about. And we can do that again in the data browser, where we can filter the data by the labeling tasks. Awesome.
And here you can see that we filtered by both of these basically labeling functions. Here we have our 6 records. Of course, if you want to clear any conflicts, you can also say only with different results. So it will only present you the records that have different results for the labeling functions that are filtered by. And here we can see that we have the conflict, for example, that we previously mentioned. So here's also a year just at the front, and we have England versus Germany. And of course, it is geopolitical, England, Germany, and it starts with a digit because it is a year. So this type of data is then really great to kind of set manually, because this is then the correct reference label for this kind of data. If you're exporting your data, then you can use the manual labels that have kind of more priority than the programmatic ones. So clearing out of these conflicts is a really good idea. Then you have clean manual labels that are correcting the conflicts that might arise in the programmatically done labels. So this, for example, is not clickbait.
Mm-hmm.
So now we labeled all this data, but we now have a list for the geopolitical, so the not clickbaity terms. I guess we should also add a list for the clickbaity terms, right?
Absolutely, that's a good idea. I saw that in the clickbaity headlines, words like literally and awesome appeared quite a lot. So maybe we want to add that as well.
So these are all really, really big words that we read in clickbait articles every day.
And also, a lot of the clickbaity articles are addressing the reader directly, and they are saying, you know, you should do this and you should do that. Neat.
So this is our final one. Here I made a typo, so I can just edit this term, correct it, and submit. Perfect. Now we have a bunch of words, and we're gonna go back to our heuristic, write a new labeling function that now integrates this kind of knowledge list. I'm gonna iterate again through these terms here and just gonna say if this term, and here, since these are direct speech and the casing doesn't really matter, I can do the term.lower, which is always recommended if you, I guess if casing doesn't make a difference, then lowering everything will have better chance to detect the true, the true fitting. So if this term.lower is in my record headline.text.lower, then I'm gonna return, of course, clickbait. Now we're gonna run this function. This is also just gonna take a second here. And here we also have estimated precision of 100%, coverage, and a bunch of conflicts. And this time we even have some overlaps. What is that, Leo?
So the overlaps are occurring when we have overlapping expressions on other heuristics. And so maybe the labels were already assigned by another heuristics.
Yeah, that is exactly
Basically.
right. And now that we have our labeling functions in place, there's one final thing that we want to do, because you can also validate basically these labeling functions in the data browser, but there's another neat thing that you can use this filter for, because you can also filter your data that is not accessed or not hit by any labeling function yet. That is great if you want to, for example, find ideas for new labeling functions. So you look on data that doesn't have you're looking on data that is not hit by these labeling functions, so you can come up with new ones. And it is also great to label data that can be used as reference data for another heuristic that we're going to come to in a second, because labeling functions are explicit knowledge that you can represent as code. But there's also sometimes there are patterns that are a little harder to explicitly represent. Leo, what do we offer in Refinery for these kind of things?
Mm-hmm. Yes, on the heuristics side, we also offer a technique called active learning. And the active learner is a really cool function to automatically label a lot of our data. And for that, we need to manually label a certain part of our data by hand. And the active learner can then look at these manual labels and find patterns in them and apply these patterns to the unlabeled data for us. And as you already stated, going through the still unlabeled data is very good, because that way we can find new patterns in the data, and we can also ensure that the active learner, which we are going to use next, basically performs as best as possible.
Yeah, as you could see here in the data browser, I just filtered by, because if you click multiple times on this, you can in or exclude it. And red means it's excluded now. It is also written as basically text here. And I excluded all of my heuristics here, and also included that it should have no label at all. And now I'm just gonna quickly label a few records here, so we can have enough training data for the active learner. So I think this is probably enough. And now we're gonna head over to our heuristics tab again and add this active learner that Leo was talking about. So the active learning module is basically a machine learning model in the background that trains on the manually labeled data, and then can make predictions on the data that was not labeled yet. Of course, these get better the more you label manually, but for this toy data set, we're gonna now introduce our active learner right now. I'm just gonna call it, my active learner, or I'm just gonna call it logistic regression, because that is what we're gonna use here.
Right, so we're going to use a relatively simple machine learning model here, because for the active learner, we also need the embeddings that we previously told you about. And these embeddings are already able to capture a lot of information in the data. And even with very simple machine learning models like the logistic regression here, we can already achieve quite a lot. And as you can see here, whenever we create a new active learner, it also already comes with a lot of code written for you. You don't need to get intimidated by this in any way. You can basically run this out of the box right now, or you can change, for example, the minimum confidence. So right now we are saying that the active learner should only assign a label to a record when it is 90% sure about a label. And I don't know about you, Moritz, but I feel a little adventurous today. So maybe let's give it a lower confidence, maybe 80%.
I think 0.8, yeah, would be fine. I guess this is adventurous enough for me, at least right now. So as Leo mentioned, this code doesn't have to intimidate you. It's really, you don't have to change much. Even as he said, you can just run it out of the box. The label names, we right now provided none. That means it just trains on all the labels. If you want to bump up the heuristic representation of particular labels, then you can specify these labels here. For example, you could just use clickbait, and then you can have an active learner that is just there to train and predict on clickbait titles. But right now, we're going to leave it as it is. Also, really cool feature that you have your embedding name right here, because these can be a little long, and you can just also click to copy, but it is also pre-filled because we just have one embedding. So we're going to run this active learner right here. As this is just a simple logistic regression, this shouldn't take too long. And as you can see, you can also use other models here right in the code. You could, for example, use a decision tree or whatever you want, but as these are our Distilbert embeddings, we're just going to go with the logistic regression, which is performing great. Again, wow. It is performing really great. So now we have all this information in the system. We have our active learner. We have, as we can see in the overview, we have our active learner. We have our different labeling functions, but this is not the end of them, right, Leo? What are we going to do with them?
No, absolutely. It's not the end. We have created a lot of labels in a very short amount of time. And I would say, let's select all of the heuristics that we now have created and hit the weak supervision button. And what the weak supervision is doing, it aggregates all the labels that we have found and combines them into a, let's say, single weak supervision label for each record.
Because these statistics that come with the heuristics are not only for us to evaluate their performance, but you can also draw really cool conclusions about the labeling functions themselves by these statistics and by their coverage, conflicts, and so on. And if you combine all of these small bits of information, then you aggregate the data to a better piece of information, and that would be the weak supervision label. Now we have run the weak supervision. It was really fast. We can also see the last run here in numbers. And here we can see how many labels is, for example, created. So 2,300 labels out of our 3,000 records. But there's also one page that we didn't pay any attention to yet, which was on purpose, because this is now the last page that we're going to visit for today. And that is, Leo, the overview page, right? What can we expect there?
Absolutely, yeah. On the overview page, we should now be able to see a lot of really cool statistics about everything that we've just done. For example, we can see how much of the data was manually labeled by us. And we can already also see how much of the data was labeled by the weak supervision system, quite a lot, actually, about 80% here. We can see the number of heuristics we have. And we can also filter these visualizations. For example, if we also have a information extraction task, we can get visualizations about that here.
Yeah, but for now, we just have our one task, which is clickbait, and also a really nice pun. But this is going to be the visualizations that you're going to have on the overview page. Here you can see that the label distributions are roughly similar. Of course, we didn't label too much. We labeled just 2%, which is 80 records manually. So the references are not really set in stone yet. And we also sometimes selectively labeled something by filtering for it. So to make sure that this distribution is really the distribution of your data, you should label randomly for a little bit. Let's put it like that. But it is also recommended before exporting your data that these, of course, if you randomly labeled manually, then these two should roughly match. Here we can also see the confidence distribution. So our weak supervision module also outputs a confidence score. And here you can just see on how many percentiles of the data, how confident the weak supervision was. One of the most useful visualizations that we have is the confusion matrix, which is just really awesome, saved a lot of days also in our development process here, because here you can see what the weak supervision label is plotted versus the manual label. So you can see where your weak supervision disagrees with your manual labeling, which is just really, really awesome, because then you can, if you see that there are red numbers here on either side, which is right now it's both 0, but if there were any red numbers, then you would go into the data browser, directly filter for them and correct them on the spot, which is just awesome. But now that we saw all this overview and we have data ready to go, Leo, we're not gonna leave this data today in the refinery because we're gonna planning on exporting it. How would we do that?
So there are multiple options to export the data out of the refinery. You could just go to the settings page and then manually export the data, which is just fine. But there's an even better way for exporting your data, because we have a very cool SDK for Python, which allows you to access the data in your refinery and pull it out of the refinery with just a few lines of code. You can just install our SDK by typing the command pip install refinery -python -SDK. And then you can use our SDK to normally log into the client with your username and your password. You can also set the project ID of your project, which you can find in the URL of your browser. And then you have full access to all of the data in the refinery. And then you can access the data, for example, in a pandas data frame, which is really, really handy if you want to work with the data that you have.
So I'm seeing that we're already a little bit over the time, but don't worry, we're gonna this is the last point basically of the live stream today. So we're just gonna go through that now. I'm gonna leave out a few details, but then you can see basically the whole workflow from your first initial creation of the project to your actual model training. Here you can see my username for localhost and a random generated password. So don't try to log in anywhere with this. This is randomly generated. There's also the project ID that you can paste in here. So here you can just go to your project. Here, this is the project ID in the URL. And you have to paste that here and specify that you want to access the localhost. You can also use a secrets.json file to initialize the client, so it doesn't have to be in this plain text, but for this live demonstration, this suffices. So I'm gonna log in right here. I'm now logged into the system, and I can just use the client to get a record export. We're just gonna look at this. And here we can see that we have our data, which is in a specific format. So we have our data itself, which is just the format it was before. But here we have the things that were added by Refinery. So we have our manual clickbait label, we have our weak supervision label, and we have also the weak supervision confidence, which is really important if you want to do any filtering after the exporting. We're gonna just quickly pre-process this. I'm not gonna go into detail what this is. This is basically just we are taking the headlines, we are taking the labels, we're combining the labels. So with what this does here basically is it just gives the manual label a higher priority than the weak supervision. So you're gonna take the manual label if the manual label is not none, and if you don't have a manual label, you take the weak supervision label. We're gonna create our training data here, our X and Y. We're gonna load the Distilbert base uncased again. We're gonna embed our data really quickly. So here, I'm gonna do this on a CPU because I don't have a GPU support installed right now. This is a fresh install of Windows 10. So bear with me for a second, but this is, we tested this. It is not going to take too long. It should be roughly about 20 seconds, I think. And then we are left with our embeddings from our data and our labels that we exported from the refinery, where we have our manual labels as a priority. And if there was no manual label, we have the weak supervision label. Now it is really important that normally you wouldn't do it like this. You wouldn't take the train test split and then just split it because, well, yeah, it just wouldn't work like that, because then you would be really positively biased, right? The best case, you would have 2 holdout data sets. So you would have one holdout data set that would be validation, where you have enough data that you can validate your trained model on, that is not in the refinery and that was not used to write any labeling functions or any other things, because then you would introduce positive bias into your estimation. So this data should be labeled manually and not by the people who write basically the labeling functions, because again, then you would introduce bias into the system. And one test data set that would be used at the very, very end to evaluate your machine learning model, because otherwise you would be overfitting on the validation data. But that is some machine learning technical things. We're just gonna run this because this is a toy example. It's gonna be performing great anyways. We're gonna fit this, we're gonna predict, and we're gonna print our classification report, which is of course really, really high. But again, this is a toy example. You would not do it like this in practice. This is just to show you basically that you can use the SDK to export your data, train a model on it, evaluate it, but yeah, use different evaluation data is basically what I'm also trying to get across here. But we are now at the end of today's stream basically. So we are, and as all the good days end, we end in the Jupyter notebook. But don't worry, we have the Q&A coming up right after this. But also, Leo, there are a few things that we haven't shown today, right?
Absolutely, that is true. Even though we covered quite a lot in the past 70 minutes, I mean, we basically created a whole project from scratch, and we ended up with a workable machine learning model, even though it's a toy data set, of course, but it's working. But yeah, we just scratched the surface, and there's quite a lot more.
So for example, what we haven't shown yet, there's information extraction labeling that we haven't gone into. For example, for named entity recognition, there's we also have a managed version actually. So we have the open source version, but we can also host it for you with some additional features. For example, crowd labeling, or you can share data slices. So all these useful slices that we created, for example, to validate labeling functions, these can be shared with a link to people, to external people, or to external people in your project. There's also a really neat feature, attribute calculation, where you can just take your attributes and calculate new ones based on your attributes, or you can calculate new attributes of your data with an outside API, so you don't have to keep uploading new data. You can just use the data that is present, and if you thought of an attribute that was missing, for example, then you could just add it later on. Also, there's a record IDE. There's just much more. So basically what we're saying, of course, this was just 1 hour long or 70 minutes. There's much more to Refinery. And if you want to know more about it, then you can stay in the Q&A. So you can join our Discord, !Discord. And then we're going to have the Q&A in a few minutes. Yeah, this is it from our side now on Twitch at least. Hop over to the Discord. Your questions will be answered, hopefully, every question. And Leo, it was just so fun. I hope we lowered the barrier of entry to this awesome open source tool. And yeah, any final words?
Yeah, I just feel the same as you, Moritz. It was so much fun to do this first peek into the refinery with you. Thank you all for watching this session with us. We really hope that you learned a lot and that you had a lot of fun with us. And if you have any questions or thought or comments, don't hesitate to hit us up or join us in the Discord session afterwards. And if not, that's also okay. And yeah, we really hope that you will have a great rest of the evening or wherever you are in the world right now.
That's exactly right. So bye-bye from our side. See you on Discord in a minute. Bye.
Take care. See you.